Anyway, our topic is learning-oriented assessment. And I don't know about you, if you're anything like other people we have actually spoken to, perhaps the first thought that comes into your head would be, isn't that kind of like formative assessment? To which my answer would probably be that, well, it's not quite that simple, okay? Though it is good that you are trying to engage with the term learning-oriented assessment and thinking in particular terms, and it seems like you're thinking about it in terms of formative assessment and summative assessment, which are the terms that everyone in the field seems to recognize. However, there's an educational researcher called Paul Newton who would say that, in fact, a formative and summative assessment is a spurious distinction. Okay? Let's try to read what he actually has to say. He says, the supposed distinction between formative and summative is not grounded in the use to which assessment judgments are put. Why? Simply because there is no meaningful distinction to be drawn. The rhetoric appears to distinguish between two conceptually distinct types of use to which results can be put. In fact, it simply foregrounds one particular type, the formative use. Okay, now, I do see some knotted brows there, so let's try to unpack that statement a little bit. Okay? He is talking about the use to which exams are put. And if you think about the use to which exams are put, well, you could think that formative assessment refers to a kind of purpose. Why are you assessing someone? Well, it's in order to form someone. In other words, to help them develop as language learners. But if you think about summative assessments, what summative assessments actually are about coming up with a score at the end of the day, which actually is about making a judgment about someone. So you see that they're actually not the same thing. But if you think about it, you know, formative assessment is about a kind of purpose guiding what happens next in the classroom. And summative assessment is a kind of judgment evaluating what has happened before. So it seems like there may actually be a connection between the two of them. Okay? But I think the easiest way to make clear why formative and summative is not a good, well thought out distinction is by asking a particular question, which is, can a summative test serve a formative purpose? Okay, now in the country I come from, this means yes, this means no, and this means I don't know. Can a summative test serve a formative purpose? Fine. Shaking one's head is too much early in the morning, you know. We haven't had our coffee yet. Okay, just answer with yes or no. Can a summative test serve a formative purpose? Yes. Okay? So if a summative test could actually serve a formative purpose, then you realize that this dichotomy is not actually a good one. Okay? Because they're not mutually exclusive categories within whatever it is supposedly trying to distinguish. Okay? In fact, you very quickly realize that, you know, what it's really trying to do is say, you know, formative assessment, classroom assessment is here on this side. Summative assessment, the large-scale exams are on that side, and it's really a way of building a wall between the two of them, saying this is us, that is them, and not just that, that, you know, we are the good guys, and, you know, they are the bad guys over there. Okay? But it makes a difference, because if you think in that way, you'll say, well, the summative assessment, let's put that to one side, I'm not going to engage with it, because it has nothing to do with me. Okay? Whereas, perhaps a more enlightened way of thinking about it is that whether we are dealing with classroom assessment or large-scale assessment, what we really want to do is, in every single instance, to help bring about learning among students. And if the point and purpose of assessment is in fact learning, then perhaps it's better to think, you know, in fact, for all assessments, whether predominantly summative or formative, the key aim really is to help improve student learning. If that's the case, then maybe what we want to think about is about learning-oriented assessment. Because the terms in which we think of things affects the way we approach things. You think formative and summative, and you end up building walls. If you think about learning-oriented assessment, you end up focusing on learning. Okay? Let me give you a definition of learning-oriented assessment given by Jim Purpura of Teachers College at Columbia University. He says that a learning-oriented approach to assessment involves the collection and interpretation of evidence about performance so that judgments can be made about further language development to promote learning. Okay? Let's leave that there for the moment. Okay? And let's think about this next question, which is, can large-scale assessment be learning-oriented? Okay? For this, I have an activity for you, which is try to determine whether each item I'm going to show you is consistent with a learning-oriented approach to assessment. Okay? So I'd like you to turn to the person seated next to you, and for the next items that are coming up, try to decide, each one of these, are they consistent with a learning-oriented approach to assessment? Okay? Take a few minutes for this. All right, let's try to hear some of the things you have come up with. Okay, I suspect I might know your answer to the first one. Okay, using large-scale assessment for accountability purposes, i.e. student performances are used to evaluate their teachers. Do you think that is in keeping with learning-oriented assessment? No. Funny that. Say why. What do you mean by it's only one factor? Okay, so let's revise the question. It's being used for accountability purposes, both to evaluate the student for high-stakes decisions and the teacher for high-stakes decisions. So your pay packet is affected, and the student's promotion and retention is also determined on the basis of that. Doesn't it shift the focus from learning to teaching? Yeah, could it shift the focus somewhere even further? Well, teachers are gonna look after old number one, and so they're not gonna focus so much on learning, but on making sure that students pass come what may. Okay, and that's what has been pointed out in the United States. There are teachers who have passed the answer on to their students. In fact, those were not even the smartest teachers. In Atlanta, they just went and filled in the answer sheets themselves in the teacher's coffee room. Okay? You should read about it, okay? Because they were all prosecuted, and there are quite a few people who are sitting in jail because of that, okay? So it does not tend to be consonant with learning-oriented assessment. Okay, fine. The second one, reporting assessment outcomes in norm reference fashion. Okay, in other words, John did better than Sam, and Mary did better than John. Ergo, Mary did better than Sam, and so on and so forth. Okay, what do you think? Is that a good idea or not? Why not? Okay, it pitches a student against each other. It doesn't actually say anything about what they have learned or not learned. All it tells you is, I'm better than John, and there are ways to make sure that you get to be better than John or Mary, right? You could kneecap them, injure them, and then they're out of the running, and you're fine, right? I don't know if you still remember the Winter Olympics many years ago between Tonya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan, right? You want a gold medal enough? That's easy, just need a baseball bat, okay? So we kind of know the answer to that one. It is not in keeping with learning-oriented principles. The third one is reporting assessment outcomes as a letter or a number. What do you think of that? Ooh, it's getting harder. That's what we do, okay? So by definition, it must be a good thing. It depends on who's reading the grade. Well, what's the thing about a letter or a number? I don't know, A, B, C, D, E? Parents love them. Okay, so it has an impact on the relationship between teachers and parents. Does it have an impact on learning? It can have an impact on learning. How might it have an impact on learning? So it could have an impact there. Could it tell them about what they need to learn next? With a letter, maybe it could tell you whether you have done well or not well, right? You have a number or a letter that tells you, I've done well, I've not done well. So that might actually feed into your motivation to learn and so on, right? Could it feed into knowing what you should learn next? In and of itself? No. You need something more, right? You could put someone on a scale up here, but that's not sufficient. What more would you need in addition to the letter or number? Oh, some sort of descriptors telling you what you know, right? So something like, at this level, someone knows this or someone knows that, right? Our final item is, telling them what they know in terms of grammatical structures. What do you think of that? It's not just grammatical, it's skills as well. Okay, so we don't just care about knows, we also care about can. Fine, okay? Now I'll tell you about can-do statements, okay? Which is that, they're actually like diplomas in the Philippines. You can buy them off of any street corner. Sorry, there are some Filipino people on staff, in Lori's staff, and you can ask them, I can tell you which street. Oh dear, I might have given myself away there. Okay, but up here, up here on the screen, you can see a number of can-do statements, right? You think can-do statements in and of themselves are enough? Probably not, right? Because up here you have some can-do statements dealing with ability to ride a bike and some to do with counting 1 to 10 and being able to order pizza for delivery. And the long and short of it is that they don't have anything to do with one another, right? So yes, it's a good idea to have a listing of what they know. Probably even better if we have a listing of what they can do. But you don't just want can do. You want a can do that has some good thinking going on behind it, okay? Perhaps some theory of ability, right? What is this thing that we're trying to say they can do? Okay, so for example, if you have a theory of mathematics, let's say, then perhaps, you might have something that's more rational where you start from at the bottom, can count from 1 to 10. And if you know how to count from 1 to 10, maybe you can perform addition and so on and so forth up until maybe, doing calculus, right? So can-do statements in and of themselves are probably not enough. You probably want some good theory of what it is you're actually trying to measure, right? And if you actually have a good theory, then you don't actually need these norm reference measures of comparing Sam to John to Mary, right? Because you can then tell, yes, Sam is at this level, he can count from 1 to 10. And the next thing to work on is addition and subtraction. And if he gets that, maybe we can work on multiplication and division, and so on and so forth. Now, let's say we actually have this good theory. Okay, let me ask you how you might go about assessing it in a way that is more learning-oriented. Okay, here are two options. One option is to say, I have separate tests covering different aspects of that ability. So I have a separate one dealing with recognition of numbers, a separate one on arithmetic. Maybe there's enough of them so I have several of them all the way up to the top. Or is it better to have one test that covers all of them? Which one do you think would be more learning-oriented? This one. Okay, why this one? I think a microphone is going your way. No wonder people don't want to speak. Okay, hold on to your microphone because I want to push you on this. If you want to give feedback to people, this would be more efficient because, in one test, I can give them feedback on numbers, arithmetic, algebra, statistics, and calculus. So I know what you're trying to say here, but say that more clearly. Oh, you hate marking too. Okay, he's assuming I hate marking, which may or may not be true, but go on. I don't know if that's the IELTS, But I do know that this looks like something else I know, but I will lay off that for the moment, okay? And I'm just gonna move on to my next point first, which is that I have drawn this out in nice, neat little boxes where one is under and the other is above. But in reality, it's probably something that looks more like this, right? They probably overlap in that someone, who's really good at numbers at some point could probably do arithmetic and so on and so forth. Okay, for the life of me, I'm not sure whether statistics is easier than calculus. If I'm wrong, please do correct me. But you get what I mean, which is that the levels do overlap in some fashion, right? And therefore, in order to establish which one is below, which one is above, and what the relationship is among these different aspects of numbers, you probably want to do some good measurement in order to ensure that this stacking up you're doing is actually well motivated, okay? Because then you can actually tell where someone is and what they need to work on next or not, right? So to make it more learning oriented, you don't just want to have these little tests that are stacking up. You want to know how they're stacking up properly, okay? So let's move away from math and think, in the field of language, do we in fact have a nice basis, not just numbers, which tell us what people know and can do. Okay, and of course, you all being smart people have already given the answer 5 minutes ago. The answer is we do have the CFR. Okay, and the CFR does include what we call can-do statements. Okay, here's my question for you. Do you think the CFR contains a good theory to tell us that the can-do statements actually mean something good and meaningful? I like this. I've been arranging my questions from easiest to harder and hardest. Nobody wants to answer anymore. Do you think the CFR has a good theory of this ability in it? That's a good question. The good thing I like about budget limits is that your bosses can't follow you around when you're traveling. So basically, whether they allow me or not, I actually have a lot of leeway in what I want to say. Except that I'm actually also being recorded this time, so I think I'll have to give the correct answer. Okay? And in fact, it might surprise you. The can-do statements themselves in the CFR are not theoretically motivated. Okay? I'll tell. I'm not done yet. I'm not done yet. I'm not done yet. Hold your horses. There is a room for horses down there where we'll be having dinner tonight. The horses are not there at the moment, so hygiene-wise, we should be fine. The can-do statements in the CFR, how they were developed, if you don't know, is that someone collected all these can-do statements from various exam boards, teachers, and so on and so forth. And then they gathered a group of teachers and said, well, which one do you think is easier? Which one do you think is harder? Which one do you think is hardest? Okay, and based on that, they listed all the can-do statements from easiest to the highest. Okay, but it's actually a random collection of can-do statements. In and of themselves, they do not have a theory behind them. Now, you're shaking your head, so I'm going to want to change that a bit. Having said that, if you actually look at the Blue Book, it does actually tell you in general terms of the theory to language ability that the CFR espouses. Okay? I love answers like this. It's yes and no, so everyone goes away happy. Okay? The CFR does tell you in general terms the theory of language that it's espousing. Okay? And actually, in the fact that it uses can-do statements already tells you the theory that it has going behind it. Okay? It's an action-oriented one. It's communicative one because it cares more about what you actually can do with language rather than what you know about language. Okay? Up to this point, you generally haven't heard about, the no bits of the CFR. You've heard about the can-do bits of the CFR. Okay? But because the CFR only tells you about the theory in most general terms, it's not enough for you to actually be able to develop a syllabus on the basis of it, okay? Because it says it's communicative, but you don't necessarily know at this particular low level, at this particular high level, how might I go about developing a course that is meaningful. Okay? So what you actually need is to put in a well thought through theory of what you think language ability is all about, or at least one that is worked out in detail. Okay? Over at Cambridge English, what we have is in fact one that we have based on what Cyril Weir has come up with, which we would call the socio-cognitive approach. Is the, if you would want the correct way of approaching this, because that is the subject of tomorrow's talk, and so you're going to have to hold your horses for even further and take the bus if you're leaving today. For the moment, hold your horses and just say that there is an approach to language ability that's been developed, and in fact, not just developed in general, because it's a nice thick book. We've also developed what it means for each of the 4 skills in particular, which are contained in 4 volumes in the Studies in Language Testing series. Okay, so there's one on writing, there's one on reading, there's one on speaking, there's one on listening. Okay, so they're big fat volumes, which are very good for holding doors open. But if you care about what Cambridge thinks about what it's measuring in its exams in each of the 4 skills, they're actually worked out there. Okay? But let's go through a quick teaser of what might be in one of them. Okay? So the people at the back will be handing out, okay, the theory of what might actually be happening in reading. And so they should be making their way to you, copies of it. And if you look in the middle column, the bits that are shaded in gray, those are the bits that are happening inside your head in the process of reading. Okay? Inside your head, what they think is happening is that you're recognizing words, you're accessing the meaning of the words, you're parsing them for what they mean, you start establishing the meaning, you infer. Sometimes you go on to build a mental model if it's a larger text, and sometimes if you're dealing with multiple texts, you go all the way to the top. You have to create an intertextual representation, i.e., how do 2 texts relate to one another? Okay? If you look on the right-hand side, it will list the different kinds of knowledge that they think are implicated so that you're actually able to read. Okay, so in order to recognize words, for example, you need to have a lexicon and you have to have some sense of orthography, morphology, etc., etc. Okay, and over on the left-hand side, what you have is what actually happens maybe just before you read or during the process of reading. That is determining the kind of reading that you're actually trying to do. Okay, so for example, the goal setter, the big box there, it talks about sometimes we need to do careful reading. Okay? If you're reading an important contract, you probably want to read the fine print, even if you never do that, and so on the internet, you've already given away your eldest grandchild. Okay? Sometimes when we read, we don't need to do careful reading. It's expeditious reading. We just want to look for a particular piece of information, so we just skip through a lot of information to find the specific type of information we care about. Okay? Now, I don't know what you think about this particular formulation of what reading is all about, but it provides you with something that is actually, if you would, testable in the sense that it can be investigated whether it is true or not. Okay? So, for example, there are people who are going to hand out a second handout now, and it's actually a test question. And in fact, you already have it, okay? And what I'd like you to do is, if you see that you could think about whether you're reading locally or globally, then you can think, well, I have a way of investigating whether my test questions are doing what they're doing, okay? So what I'd like you to do right now is take a look at that text that you have and the question you have, and tell me, what sorts of reading do you need to do in order to be able to answer that question? Okay? And so the lines actually tell you the direction in which his eyes are moving, and the circles tell you about him stopping at particular points, and the larger the circles, the more time he is staying at that particular point, okay? So I'm gonna play this particular video to show you this particular test taker taking this question and what he is doing. And I think as I annotate what's happening, you'll get a sense of what's going on inside of his head, okay? And when I play this, let's look at this one because I'm gonna use the pointer to point at some of the things in here. Faux pas is coming up. I'm not sure how, you know, that's not quite English, so maybe, you know, a little bit of time there. And finally, he's gotten back to the eek moment. Oh, okay, I'm thinking really hard there. And I'll read it again. So now I'll try to see some of the options. Anger at his friend in the USA. So let's see the USA bit. I remember it's here, so I'll look there. Faux pas? Okay, I'm spending a lot of time trying to figure out whether USA is the correct answer. And which is why I'm reading this, these bits right here, the eek moment. I'm thinking really hard, it's not. So I'm gonna try this other option. I looked at this quickly. That's probably not it, so I'm gonna go for feelings of embarrassment. Goes back. I'm checking which question I'm at. Feelings of embarrassment is what I go for. That seems to be the most likely, and I'm gonna check my answer. And you see he goes back and tries to read most of the second paragraph. Just to make sure, because, you know, I think if you agree, A and C are the most likely, so they're kind of hard to distinguish. So you kind of have to check, is it C? No, it's clearly not B. It's probably A. But I'm gonna make sure it's not USA, the eek moment. So finally, I've decided that's my answer. Yeah, no, maybe C, maybe D, no. C, really, C might be a possibility. This, by the way, is not a very strong candidate for this particular exam, okay? In fact, he ends up taking 4 or 5 minutes for this question. If you do that on the real test, you're probably done for. Okay, I think we need to put him out of his misery. He's about there, I think. Well, I'm not gonna put him out of his misery, but here's a question for you. Did he actually read the third paragraph at all? No, his eyes have not traveled there at all, okay? At the beginning, he did quickly read through the first paragraph, but as you can tell, a lot of the red bits are focused on the second paragraph, okay? So you and I, based on a theory, have a hypothesis on what is being measured in a test, and in fact, we have ways of investigating whether our theory is, our hypothesis is in fact correct, okay? So there you go, okay? On the other hand, if you look at the top bit, what I was trying to refer to earlier, it also says you need to create an intertextual representation, okay? In other words, we think that trying to figure out what one text is saying is qualitatively different from figuring out, you know, how two texts might relate to one another, okay? And that is different. Why? Because obviously, person A is not gonna comment on the quality of the ideas in person B's text if they're on the same topic, and vice versa. So the task of coming up with a relationship between those two texts rests with the reader. Yeah? Which is why, for example, if you look at, this question, by the way, is a CAE or a Cambridge Advanced question, which is why if you look at the CAE from 2015 on, we have a part 6 of reading, I believe this is, which gives you several different texts. And then the question is, which reviewer has a different opinion from the others on the confidence with which de Botton discusses architecture? Okay? It forces the reader to figure out the relationship of ideas across more than one text. Okay? So you see that you do have, if you have a good theory, you have a nice rationale basis for coming up with test questions at different levels of ability. Because you can take this and say, well, it all starts with word recognition. So maybe at the YLE level, I'm just gonna cover things about word recognition and lexical access, okay? But when I'm at the higher education level and I'm working on advanced and proficient people, maybe I need to test intertextual representation in it. Okay? So if you actually have a good theory, you have a good basis for coming up with the level-based tests that you have. Okay? Which is, in fact, what we have come up with in Cambridge. Right? Now, here's a question for you. Laurie mentioned that we now have the Cambridge English scale. What do you think might be the reason we came up with it? And might it have a learning-oriented purpose? Because if you have this particular theory of ability, you know that word recognition, even if it's at the lowest level, is probably implicated in some of the higher levels, and so on and so forth. So you're never going to be able to cut them up such that you only cover one level. There will always be overlap between them, okay? But why then do you need a scale? I mean, you could have the overlap without the numbers if you would. Okay, this might be slightly harder, so I'll give you the answer, okay? I buckled, I'm sorry. Failure. Some of you have worked with learners who are taking Cambridge Proficiency, okay, which you know is actually targeted at the C2 level. It's as high as you get with a CFR. Okay, so some of them, who took Pete's exam retake option, was just 3 points below the pass mark for CPE. And so in his old statement of results was called a narrow fail. Okay? So this student goes to an institution or whatever, the immigration authorities with his certificate and statement of results, and it says there, narrow fail. Okay? And what do you think those people think? Well, this is not a very good result. I'm sorry, I'm not going to accept it. Right? But in fact, a narrow fail on CPE is, the technical term for this is pretty damn good, right? That's actually higher than C1, okay? But it was getting hard for people to know how these different exams might relate to one another, okay? So if you made it more transparent, if you made the relationship among the different exams more transparent, you make it easier for people to know where they are, and so it makes it easier for them to know what to work on next, okay? So there. We think it goes some way in trying to help learning along. Okay? Here's another question for you. So it does range anywhere from below A1 up to C2. Okay. How many of you have taught the same group of students from when they were below A1 all the way up to when they were at C2? Anyone? 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 One person. How many of your students did you teach from below A1 to C2? 6. Okay, so there were 6 of them. Out of a career of teaching how many students? Too many to mention. I walk around the streets and they're always assaulting me because there's so many of them, right? Good, right? In theory, if everyone in this room always taught every student they had from below A1 all the way to C2, you probably don't need an exam board like Cambridge anywhere in the picture at all, because you know the students and you can follow them up and know that they are moving up. Okay? But the reality is, for most of us, we get them at one particular point in their learning journey, and someone else has to get them at the next point. And if we're just leaving people individually to figure out where someone is and figuring out on the basis of that what they need to work on next, it will not be a very coherent thing. Whereas if you actually do have a well-validated ladder, that can provide a basis, a very good basis for a coherent learning program for a student. Does that make sense? Yeah? Because, I'll leave my because. Okay, so let's think about this. Here's the original definition. A learning-oriented approach to assessment involves the collection and interpretation of evidence about performance so that judgments can be made about further language development to promote learning. Okay? If you think about what we've done with our exams, do you think it provides evidence about people's language abilities? Yes, right? And can you make judgments on the basis of it? If it was just a letter, maybe a little, but not a lot. Okay? But if you actually have a well-validated can-do statements, which have a theory of learning behind them, and the exams are actually built based on that theory of learning, then you can actually make very sound judgments about language development, which will promote learning. Okay? So much for the large-scale summative side of things. Okay, let's think about classroom assessment. Are they necessarily learning-oriented? Okay, so here is me as a young man. Ethnically I'm Chinese. And here are some assessment practices I've encountered when I was growing up. Okay, and if it's a good one, say yay, and if it's a bad one, say boo. Okay, here's one. Find obscure information to make the test hard. Boo. Okay, here's the second one. Okay, none of my classmates came into the class doing the readings. The teacher was very angry, so he gave a quiz. Boo, okay? You should boo louder for that one. I'm kind of worried that you haven't booed because it might tell me something. Here's the third one. Extra points for going to the basketball game because, we care about basketball in the Philippines. Boo, it has nothing to do with language ability. Extra questions for bonus points. Yeah, you kind of like that. The correct answer for that, I'd like to say, is boo, but go ahead if you want a yay. Okay, test that most people will pass. Okay, the students say yay. The test should probably not about whether people pass or fail. It's about measuring what they have actually learned. Test most people will fail. Yay, nay, boo, whatever, okay? I've never been booed more in my life, okay? But more seriously, here's a question about classroom assessment. And you don't have to answer this out loud. Just think about your own answer for yourself. And in fact, I know I've given the wrong answer myself on this one. Okay? After a day at school, to think about, whether you're learning-oriented. After a day at school, which of the statements below are you more likely to think of? Hum. I like that hum. I think it tells me a lot. Okay? Because if you're anything like me, at the end of the day, you're more likely to think of this first statement rather than this second statement. Right? And if you think of the first statement, this is how you're more likely to teach. I have a lesson I've prepared. I'm going to deliver it. And, I've delivered it. So, blue ribbon, gold star, well done, pat on the back. Because, today what I taught was this. Great. Okay? But see, if your focus is on what you taught, you haven't even necessarily thought about whether your learners have learned what you have taught. On the other hand, if you go home thinking today what my students learned was, well, this is a more challenging activity, isn't it? Because you don't have to just think about what you said. You need to think about, well, what has Tom over there done? What has Dick over there done? What has Harry over there done? Have they learned something? You're more likely to think about, well, what have they shown me? And I've observed that based on the task I've set them, this is what they did. And therefore, I think this is what's happening with them. And maybe I'll keep a record of it just so I don't forget it because I have lots of students. And then I'll provide them with some sort of feedback because I want them to learn. And based on that feedback, I might think about what next I make them do so that they continue with their learning. Okay. Do you see? If you have a learning-oriented lens, you don't think about what I taught. You think about, well, what has my student learned? And you end up teaching in a slightly different fashion. Much harder, I would say, but better. Okay. Let's take a look at one part of this wheel. Okay. You have a performance, and you have an observation, and you have an interpretation. How can you go about interpreting what you saw little Johnny do? All I wanted to say there is obviously little Johnny needs to know what the learning objectives might be, right? You cannot interpret things in isolation. If you collect evidence, it always has to be in relation to something else, okay? Some of them might be their previous performance, okay? I did worse on Grand Theft Auto before. I did better now because I learned some of the extra language in there. It might be the learning goals or objectives you set. In fact, the more you make this transparent to them, the more they know what they're learning, the better it is for their learning. It might be the assessment criteria, which is why at Cambridge we try to make the writing and speaking criteria available to the public. It might be exemplars. They hear, you know, this is what a good speaker does. How good am I compared to this? It might be can-do statements. It could be a lot of things, but it always needs to be relative to something, right? So we can't just keep on teaching. We need to know what it is we're trying to do, okay? So here's a question for you to talk to a seatmate about again, briefly. In the classroom context, could you rank the following in order of practicality in terms of collecting, assessing, interpreting, and providing feedback? Take about 2 or 3 minutes for this. We're not going to do feedback for this one, because actually the details of a lot of these, I'm sure you will end up working on in your workshops later today and also tomorrow. All I want to say with this one is that, as you might imagine, some of them might be good evidence but harder to collect. Some of them might be evidence of another sort that's easier to collect. But at the end of the day, if you want a learning-oriented classroom, what you would want would be, according to the definition, collecting a wide range of evidence so that when you put it all together, you have a good picture of what your student has learned or has not learned, right? In some cases, obviously, maybe technology might be helpful, right? In the cycle I gave you, you do need to record some of the things. You can't just give them weekly tests and say, you know, well, that sounds pretty nice, and give it back without recording what they did, because it's not gonna inform you, you would have forgotten how they did. So recording is an important bit, and if technology is helpful there, you do it. But whatever it is, you need to collect a range of evidence so that you could actually interpret and make judgments so that you can help further their language development. Okay? So to put it all together, the two of them, the summative bit and the classroom bit, if you think about it, there is this vertical dimension. Okay? As we said, nobody here tends to teach anyone from below A1 all the way to C2. And if you actually have a well-designed exam system that will track people as they move their way up, what you have is a tool for creating a coherent learning program for your learners. Okay? So this is a vertical dimension. It's a quantitative dimension. It's something that people like us would be in a good position to do because we don't deal with the students on a day-to-day basis. Our job is to help you tell on the macro level where your students are. On the other hand, at any given time, there is also a horizontal dimension. That is, within any given class, you will have students who are all different from one another. And this is the qualitative dimension of learning. And this is clearly the domain of teachers like yourself, because you need to figure out what each student is able to do and not able to do, and make those minute adjustments so that the learning takes place. Okay? Let me represent this in a slightly different fashion. Okay? You have here the work that we do, which is to provide high-level objectives for learning with a macro view. And at any one point, one of your students will be at one of these levels. And so your syllabus can be developed based on the high-level objectives we've come up with. And on the basis of that, you enter the teaching-learning cycle that we looked at earlier, where you set them a task, you make observations, interpretations, you record them down, you give them feedback, and so on and so forth. So you have your informal records, which feed into the larger record. But at the same time, it's also good to know, well, have they learned things? So an external exam can give you a more macro record of where they are in this particular system. And as you can see, they actually all fit within one big diagram. Okay? There are lots of people who talk about teaching to the test. My question to you is, if in fact your test is a well-constructed test that covers all the things you care about, is teaching to the test a bad thing? Not at all. Okay? If you have a well-developed test there is no reason why teaching to the test should be a problem. Okay? With this in mind, I'd just like to quickly go back and say, here is your definition. Can classroom assessment and large-scale assessment give us evidence about performance to help us with making judgments on what to do next? Yes. And when they're all coordinated, like we saw in this particular picture, then we provide the optimal conditions for learners to actually learn. Okay? This is something we do care about, and so we try to investigate this. So here are some feedback from our students. Okay? Here's a student who took flyers, and I want to learn more English. I draw a picture of me from me doing the Cambridge exams. They were fantastic because one of my favorite subjects at school. It's a very beautiful language. Okay? If you make your tests appropriate, it actually feeds their motivation. Okay? And these are people who then say, I can do the exam. I can do the exam. I'm drawn this because I think the Cambridge is an opportunity to learn more English. I can speak with other person in English. I love English. They recognize that the exam is about being able to communicate in English. Okay? Some people are just more direct. I love English. Okay? With this exam, I know how much I learned of English this year, and I like English a lot. Taking a test helps them know what they have achieved thus far. It's actually making them love English more. Finally, I love these people. This must be Swiss or something. My picture represents that if you learn English and take Cambridge exams, when you're older, you will get a very good advance at knowing English because you will go to other countries and get a very good job of knowing English, right? It's all about the money. Show me the money. But I think we have evidence that good exams could actually help promote learning, if not, enhance the size of your pockets. Okay? Let me close with a quote from Spolsky, who is a historian of language assessment. He says, from the earliest years, the Cambridge test writers and their various committees saw themselves as sharing with the schools not so much an examination as the culmination of a teaching process. We're not just about exams, we see it as part of this whole cycle. He goes on to say, before the word backwash had even been coined, they regularly asked whether modifications being proposed in the formal examinations would be accepted by the schools. And that is still something we do to this day. When we revise our exams, they always go out to the schools. We get their feedback to figure out how does this actually square up with the things you're actually doing in the classroom as well. Okay? This is still true, as it was all the 27 years that Lori has been working with you here in Switzerland. And so for your partnership with us in the past and to come in the future, on behalf of Cambridge English, thank you very much and good morning.